Okay, very good. My name is John Hamer, and I am the coordinator of the meetup, and I often give the lectures here, but I'm very happy to say that we have a guest lecturer today, Brian Carwana, who is the director of the Encounter World Religions Center. We talk a lot about Encounter World Religions Center here because we talk about how we have here in Toronto during, you have to tell me the dates.
July 8th to 14th.
July 8th to 14th of this year, we have the Discovery Week, where you meeting over at the University of Toronto. Brian, for an entire week, you get it with a cohort of very interesting people, just like what we have here at the lecture group. Brian will do an incredible course, an hour and a half on Islam. Then you go to the mosque and you actually do the Friday prayers. An hour and a half on Judaism. We go to the yeshiva. We go to the Reform Synagogue for Shabbat. You learn about the Sikhs. You go to the Gurdwara. You learn about Hindus, and we go to the temple. So in other words, it's an entire week. And how many religions?
11
religions. So it's an amazing, amazing experience. I can't say enough about it. So we have the information, I think, about it. You've got a handout for it. And so definitely something to be considering. So when we always start our meetup, we say what our mission is here at Toronto Centre Place, which is to invite everyone into community to continually learn and grow, to abolish poverty and end needless suffering, to promote peace and justice, and to live life meaningfully together. And so now we're going to watch a brief little video about the encounter, if Leandro comes back. Leandro? We watch the video?
There's feedback.
I know, so he turned this up, and so now there's feedback.
That's great. Thanks, John, for that intro. If you are interested in that week, while I have a self-interest in telling you to go. It is the coolest thing I do all year. My predecessor's the visionary who came up with the program. I'm the lucky bloke who inherited it. But it is a brilliant program. I so enjoy doing it because I know how much people get out of it. And if you think you'd like to travel the world and explore all these cultures in 1 week, I'd love to have you. I think you will be thrilled with it. And as I say, I always feel that much of my year is geared towards getting people to come there because I so look forward to it. Okay, so tonight's presentation is not as geared actually to my work with as the director of Encounter, but comes out of my PhD work. I've been working on my PhD for 100 years at the University of Toronto. And it's on evangelical politics in Canada. The talk tonight is not on the subject of my dissertation, but it's stuff I had to learn about the history of evangelicalism in order to do my dissertation, if that makes sense. So today we're going to talk about evangelicalism and Pentecostalism. A quick note about terminology. Sometimes when people say evangelicals, they are separating them from Pentecostals and from another group that we might call fundamentalists. Fundamentalists are like evangelicals, but a little more further in, or hardcore, or whatever term you want to use. But sometimes people use the term evangelicals to mean the umbrella term of all these groups. And tonight you will hear me using this term both ways. So sometimes when I say evangelicals, I mean the whole group, but sometimes you'll note that I'm talking about evangelicals and Pentecostals. So just knowing that, I think, will help you to sort of follow along. Evangelicalism is a growth business in the religious world, a plant that has sprouted in the last 2.5 centuries that has done quite well. And what I want to argue to you tonight, or suggest to you, is that it has grown, obviously, from Christian roots. It is inspired, of course, out of the Christian tradition, and that it's biblical and all that sort of stuff. But that it has grown in the soils of the modern world, of modernity. And as a result, the plant is really a combination of both. It has these Christian roots, but we all become what we eat. We're all affected by our environment. And what it has been consuming is the soils of the modern world, of liberalism, of secularism, of capitalism. And these things are part of its DNA. And so I'm going to suggest to you tonight, first, that evangelicalism and Pentecostalism are very modern religions. And by modern, I don't mean just chronological. I don't just mean they're recent. And I don't mean better. Sometimes modern means like better. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that these religions are adjusted to the modern world. They grew up literally in the same geographies, in the same time periods as the structures of the modern world was birthed, like in America and in Britain in the 18th and 19th century. And because they grew up at the same time, they are modern religions. They from the very get-go, they were adjusted to that sort of, to the modern world. And as a result, this modern DNA helps these religions succeed in the modern world. Today in the West, Catholicism is waning. It's not as modern, if I can put it that way. Again, I don't mean it's not, this isn't a ranking of better. Liberal Protestantism is certainly suffering. But evangelicals are doing reasonably well in the West. They're holding their own. And in other parts of the world, they are flourishing. And part of my argument to you tonight is because they are adjusted to they were born at the same time as the modern world, and they're adjusted to it. I'm going to mix my metaphors here for a moment. I've just given you a plant metaphor. I'm going to go to a different metaphor. So the other part of this argument is that in my dissertation, I say that we have the culture wars. You've all heard of the culture wars, right? If you watch U.S. news, that's all it is, right? There's the liberals and there's the evangelical Christians, and they're at war, and they're so opposed to one another. But I'm going to suggest to you tonight that they are actually more like siblings in a family. And sometimes siblings don't get along, right? But if you step back to them, he's completely different from me, right? But if to someone from the outside, you can see, oh, there's a family resemblance. Liberals and evangelicals grew up out of the same Anglo-American universe in the same time period. And despite differences, and I'm not saying the differences don't exist, but despite the differences, I want to suggest to you that there's a family resemblance. Okay? So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Does that all sound good? You're all kind of trapped here for an hour, so that's good. Okay. So what is the environment that evangelicalism grew up in? It grows up after the Age of Enlightenment, and the Age of Enlightenment is the time where reason becomes the source of understanding in the West. There's a newfound confidence in human reason and its ability to figure out the motions of the planets, the motions of objects on Earth, and to solve problems. Before this, the tendency was to look for truth in the past. The real reservoir of truth was something in the past. It was in the Bible, or it was with the great Greek philosophers like Aristotle. But now in the Age of Reason, they start saying, no, actually, it's a progressive idea. We're actually going to surpass what was in the past. We're going to figure it out in the future using reason. And this poses a challenge to religion, not only because it's saying it's reason rather than the Bible, but some of these folks will start poking holes in the Bible, right? It says the sun stopped in the sky. Well, now there's these astronomers saying there's no way, right? Everything would collapse. You're not understanding how the physical universe works. So they start poking holes that the theologians do not have great answers for. Now, although the Age of Reason is a powerful movement, all movements will tend to generate counter-movements or counter-reactions. And so there were some counter-responses to the Age of Reason within the broader culture. One of those responses was Romanticism. And Romanticism is a movement that the Age of Reason really says what makes us who we are is our brains. It's that we think and we can logic. That's what separates us from the beast and what makes us fully human. And eventually the Romantic era sort of says, this just turns us into like machines. We're just cognition machines. Not only were they using reason to figure out the motion of the planets, but some people believe that eventually we'd be able to use reason to figure out the laws of human behavior. And you still have this today in cognitive science, right? There are some cognitive scientists who say that free will is an illusion, that once you figure out the neural mechanisms, we are kind of more machine-ish or whatever. And the response of Romanticism is to say, pshaw to that. No. What makes us human is not arid logic, it's our passions. It's our emotions. It's that we can love. It's that we can see beauty. It's that we can be moved and stirred. Okay? And this affected things like art. There was a Romantic era in art and music. And it was also the birth of the novel. If you guys like to read novels, you know what a novel's like. It's not a deduction on logic. It explores the inner emotional life of the person. And there's something about that we find very human. Okay, so that was one response, Romanticism. Another response, however, comes from this guy, John Locke. And John Locke is a very famous philosopher. He did lots of wonderful things. But I'm just going to focus on one of his ideas tonight. And that is that, sorry? Sorry. And I'm just going to focus on one of the things he did tonight. And that is an idea some of you might have heard of called the blank slate. Have you heard of that term, the blank slate? Yes, that's right, tabula rasa. What he said is that there was a tendency before Locke to assume that that character was innate. There was a strong tendency towards the notion of destiny, of who you're going to be and what you're going to be like. And Locke says, no, this is garbage. When you're born, you are a tabula rasa. You are a blank slate. And who you become depends on your circumstances. Who are your parents? What did they teach you? What at hoity-toity schools, and they were celebrated lecturers. But in the evangelical movement, they have commoners as ministers who have no theological education. The biggest evangelical movement that grows in this century are called the Methodists. The Methodists have these people called circuit riders, and they go from town to town preaching. And I go there and I preach, and you have a born-again movement. And I talk to you afterwards, and you have such a great story, and I say, would you come up front and tell your story? And you do a great job. Everyone is really moved by what you have to say. And I say, you should come back tomorrow and talk again. And then I say, I'm going to this town down the road. Would you come along? And 2 weeks later, we send you on your own because you're really good at it. And you are now a Methodist circuit rider. You will lead these things. You have no theological degree, no training. You're not well versed in the Bible, but you can tell a great story. right? And so the religious leaders now become the commoners rather than elites who went to Yale or something like that. And you can still see this today. Now, a lot of evangelical ministers today do get schooling, but do any of you know who this is? Joel Osteen? Some of you do? He's got to be the most televised preacher in the United States. Joel Osteen has no theological education. His dad ran the church. He went and got, I think, a communications degree or something. And his dad dies, and they throw him up on the pulpit on Sunday, and he does a good job. And then they throw him up the next week and the next week. And now the guy owns the stadium that the Houston Rockets used to play basketball in. He fills it every Sunday. He's all over TV. I saw him. He came here to Toronto to the Air Canada Centre and filled the place up. Osteen does not have a degree in divinity or theology or religion, but he can tell good stories, right? So it's commoners who can speak to the people. So now a different kind of religious leader. So that's one change. The second one is because you have different leaders, the sermons will change. In the established churches, those learned people gave great lectures on theology and, original sin and the nature of the Trinity and stuff like that. But in evangelicalism, the sermons will shift to storytelling, to emotional narratives. And this is really good in the age of reason, because the thing is, if you want to use reason to go after those sophisticated theological sermons, it's a pretty good weapon. You will find holes. You can attack things like the Trinity and the miracles of the virgin birth. But imagine instead that this gentleman is talking to you, and his story is that he used to be an alcoholic, and he had lost his job, and his marriage was on the rocks, and he was a terrible dad. And then he found Christ, and now he's a good dad, and he's got his job back, and his family's there beside him, and they have tears down their eyes. Try and use, sorry?
Country song.
Country
Play
song.
backwards.
Play backwards, yes. But try and use reason to poke a hole in that. Who cares about your logical problems? This guy's life has been transformed, right? It's not only powerful, it's inoculated against the attacks of the age of reason. In the early 1700s, the most famous sermon probably in American history is told. It's by this guy, Jonathan Edwards. Lovely title, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And Edwards is a brilliant guy, and it's it's Calvinist theology and stuff like that. Erudite, all that sort of thing. But in the 20th century, the leading evangelical of the 20th century by 1,000 miles is Billy Graham. And if you've ever heard Billy Graham talk, Billy Graham does not have some sophisticated theology to dump upon you. Billy Graham tells stories, and he tries to move you. He tries to shift your life. He tells you about people whose lives have been transformed. Storytelling instead of theology. Okay, so now we have new leaders, and we have new sermons. Third, how you get saved, that is, salvation, will change. In the 1750s, in the United States, overwhelmingly, Americans are Calvinists. And that means that your salvation is determined by what's called predestination. Do you all know what that means? God has determined in advance whether you're going to be saved or damned. This can seem offensive to a lot of modern people, but back then they weren't as invested in human freedom, and what they were invested in was God's power. In the human freedom model, God has less power because you kind of decide whether you're going to be good or bad, and God is really reduced to a recorder of your deeds. But in this model, no, God determines everything. We all deserve to be damned. We're all sinful, but God, out of his goodness, will save a few. So predestination. The problem with this is when the United States is born, this doesn't fit the ethos anymore. Now what is the United States emphasizing? It's emphasizing that the individual has freedom, that the individual should choose, that they should be able to vote, right? You choose for who should be your leaders. It needs a theology that values human choice. And so within a century, overwhelmingly, American Protestants will now follow what is called Arminianism. It's named after a guy named Arminius. All it means is free will. Now you will choose whether you're saved or not because you will determine as an agent, as a free agent, whether you want to follow Jesus or not. And you can see how that fits with America, right? The valuing of the individual, the idea that you can become whatever you want to become, you can follow whatever profession you want. You can vote for whoever you want, and you can decide whether to follow Jesus or not. Right? So you can see how the theology fits this new country. Next is that the focus of their worship changes. Some scholars have noted that, again, in the early 1700s, just before this period, the sermons focused on God. And God is the Father and the Judge. And he sits in judgment of you. You are a wayward sinner, and it's your need to sort of fix yourself. By the end of the century, the sermons shift far more to emphasizing Jesus. And it emphasizes Jesus as your friend, as someone who you have a relationship with. If I can just add a bit of stuff here. At this time in the United States, actually in the Anglo-American world, maybe even the West in general, there was a new, you remember I said that the individual now is held in higher esteem, like there's individualism? There was a new valuing of human emotions. A century or so earlier, like if you think of the Puritans, for example, they had sort of a negative view of natural human emotions. Humans are naturally willful. They don't want to follow God. And so if you're a Puritan dad, you love your children, but the way you love your children is you discipline them. You correct them from their natural willfulness so that they will follow God and be good, right? By, say, 1800, with the birth of Romanticism, the idea now is that natural human emotions are actually quite good, that people's natural emotions are to love and to seek beauty. This is where we get the notion that we have in our society of childhood is born here, where we all see children as innocent and naive and pure. They're all little angels, right? You know that notion. That wasn't there a century or two earlier, but it's there now. And so just as there's this new valuing of emotions, and a new model for parent models, parental books will sort of change. Instead of saying you need to discipline your kids, they'll tell the fathers you need to love your kids. And so what happens? It's a different notion of God. It goes from the stern father, the Puritan dad, if you will, to the Father who loves you and is even your friend, which is Jesus. Okay? This will not only affect the way that theology is carried out, it will even affect the scriptures that people have in their hands. Because in the late 1700s in the United States, printers, for the first time, will start reaming off loads, not of Bibles, but of just New Testaments. Right? Can you imagine why that is? Right? They drop off the Old Testament, because in the Old Testament, there's a little bit more of a stern judge, right? And so they can't edit it, go back and change it. You just can't do that. But what they place in your hand is just that New Testament with Jesus. Right? This is why when you go to a hotel somewhere and you open up, often there's not a Bible, often there's just a New Testament. Okay? And they would, sorry, what's that?
It used to be the Gideon Bible.
Yeah, you will sometimes get a Bible, but sometimes you'll get just a New Testament. The other
How often am I in a mouth?
well, maybe I've got that wrong. But anyways,
Times a year, in fact.
you would get at this time a printing of New Testaments. What they did print from the Old Testament separately sometimes were just the Psalms, which again sort of fit into this model of loving. Okay, so new theological focus. The other thing that changes at this time is the role of congregants. In the old churches, the congregants will sit and listen to the erudite sermon. In the new evangelical churches, the congregants have to participate emotionally, right? They have to get up, and they have a role to play in the service. They get up and say, Amen, and Alleluia, and praise the Lord. And if the service is effective, this will happen. The ministers know that an effective service is to have this, and you will hear them call out for it. Can I have an Amen? Right? They'll do that sort of thing, right? You know that you need it. And the highlight of the service is the altar call, when some people will come up front and they will be blessed or anointed, and they're kind of having their born-again moment, right? And this is what makes an effective service. It's not just a sermon. It's not just a sacrament. It's the emotional response, okay? And so this refers to what I showed you earlier, is that the personal experience of the congregants demonstrates to everyone that there is religious power at work, okay? And this stresses the individual over, say, a creed or over the church. Okay, any questions about that? Okay. Music will change. They will. Oh, sorry. Yes.
I'd like to go back to Wellesley.
Yes.
He had a hierarchy. He was an educated man,
Mhm.
and it wasn't.
Yeah.
He was quite stern in his theology.
Yes.
Right. I'm going to say we were still we're recording this and
We're live also.
and live streaming it. And so when you're going to have a question, I need to give you the microphone. And so if I fail to repeat the question,
Yeah.
then answer.
Sure, okay. So the question was that Wesley, John Wesley, who I'd mentioned earlier as kind of the founder of Methodism, was a very educated man and a stern person, and that he had a hierarchy. And that is very true. You're very right. With Wesley, he almost has a foot in both camps a little bit. He's kind of a transition person. But he does privilege the kind of emotional experience. But you're right. There is some of the older stuff there. He himself is educated, but the Methodist circuit riders often are not, the people who are going out and spreading it. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Music will be populist too. They will move from classical hymns to things like gospel music. And gospel music plays off of things like bluegrass and stuff like that. The big hymn of the period, the most successful hymn, is probably Amazing Grace, which is written in the UK, but really takes off in the United States. And here's some of the opening lines of this song. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now can see. It's storytelling, right? This is the story of every testimony. I once was lost, now I'm found. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, and notice this last line, the hour I first believed, right? It's the born again moment. Maybe you were born Christian, but you were lost until this happened, until that moment happened. Okay? So now we have populist music. And lastly, the last thing I want to mention to you is ecclesiology. It's a big word. It just means the church structure. And with the established churches, they will have top-down hierarchies. And you were right that the Methodists will have a top-down hierarchy. But some of the evangelical branches that will grow will have more local control of churches. And what this means is that they will be more innovative and adaptive. You might have a brilliant idea for running a Catholic church. You might know where it should be and how it should run and how the liturgy should go, but you cannot go set that up. You just can't. You might have a wonderful idea of an Anglican church, and again, maybe you know where it should be and who should run it and what it should look like and the visual, but you can't go set up an Anglican church. The Anglican church sets up Anglican churches. But if you have an idea for an evangelical church, you can set it up. And this weekend across North America, a bunch of people will. They'll invite people to their houses for a coffee or to their basement. And they'll start this up. They'll start up a little group.
The Church of St. Tim.
And it's
Amen.
and it's innovative and it's adaptive. And you know what happens? It's like the high-tech industry, right? There's 1 million people in their garages starting up the next high-tech business, and 99% of them maybe don't go anywhere really big. But somebody starts up Apple. Somebody starts up Google or Facebook. And the same thing happens here, is that some of these people start up great things. And they notice that this model is adapted to, I'm sorry the screen's so low here, but this fits a secular state. Evangelicalism is not looking for the state to support it as a religion, right? Like in France, the Catholic Church was aligned with the state, and even in Quebec it was, right? The evangelicals are not looking for state support. They're ready to compete in a spiritual marketplace. They're used to America, where it's open and free, and that's how business works, right? And so they're all starting these churches in their basement, and eventually some of them turn into Google. This is Rick Warren. I don't know if you've heard of Rick Warren. He's a pastor in California. He is amazingly successful. Here he is. He did the blessing at Barack Obama's inauguration. Just started a church on a whim, but was really good at it. This is Benny Hinn, who some of you might have seen late night on your television sets. Benny Hinn is healing people. There's miracles happening all the time. He's casting out demons. Rick Warren would not like Benny Hinn. But it doesn't matter. There's some people who gravitate towards Warren. There's some people who gravitate towards Hinn. Some people like Apple and cannot stand Microsoft, and some people are the other way, right? It's a similar sort of thing. This is T.D. Jakes, who's one of the most popular African-American preachers in the United States. And I've already mentioned to you Joel Osteen. Joel Osteen is all upbeat. God wants you to succeed. God's going to give you blessings. God's going to make you rich. He's going to help you in your career. It's the power of positive thinking. Everything's going to go wonderful. Warren would find Osteen a little vacuous. But again, they appeal to different groups. And this even happens in Canada. Who do we have in Canada? Perhaps Canada's most successful Protestant minister is this guy, Bruxy Cavey, who's in Burlington. The Meeting House. Some of you have heard of the Meeting House. Bruxy, you'll notice, is dressed down. Yeah, and his own parishioners sort of say, but my God, he looks so sloppy. It's intentional. He said when he grew up going to church, people dressed up, and it was a marker of class. You could tell who had money and who didn't have money. And so he shows up on stage with jeans and a T-shirt. And some of his message fits Canada more than it does the United States. So, for example, many of you will associate evangelicals with political activism. And this sells in the United States, but it's a little dicey here. He has no involvement with politics. I know someone who wrote a PhD on him. He's, listened to 100 of his sermons. He said, I have never heard him in a sermon address a political issue of the day, not once. He doesn't vote, and he tells his people he doesn't vote. He even discourages them from voting because he says you don't change the world through politics, you change it through bringing people to Christ. And another nod to Canadian sympathies, perhaps more than Americans, he's a pacifist. Now, if he was like Osteen in Texas arguing for pacifism, I don't know that it works so well, right? But he's in a different cultural soil, and it works, right? 1 million people starting up churches in their garages. And Cavey now speaks. There's about 2,000 people who show up in Oakville on a Sunday, but he's beamed to all the movie theaters in cities across Ontario. You can go into Ottawa to the Cineplex Odeon on Sunday morning and listen to him at 11 a.m., or Guelph, or London, or Windsor, or Barrie. Right? So this is evangelicalism. It's innovative, and it's adaptive. Okay? It is also kind of entrepreneurial. It's used to capitalism. I showed you this guy earlier. This is a guy who did the blessing at Barack Obama's inauguration, Rick Warren. Rick Warren has written this book called The Purpose-Driven Life. Have any of you heard of this book before? I think so. A few of you have. If you go onto Google and type best-selling books of all time and go to the Wikipedia page, it's going to be there like in the top dozen or so. Harry Potter outsold it, but not much else. It has been translated into a gazillion languages. Its opening line is a very famous line, and it says, it's not about you. It's not about you. It's about something greater than you, about giving your life to something greater. So that's Rick Warren. Made a gazillion dollars and got his message out using capitalism in the book industry. Here's another set of book series. This is the Left Behind series, written by the LaHaye's, and it's an end time story. It's a whole series of how the world's going to end and what's going to happen. Kirk Cameron plays the lead in the movie. These books are so popular. At one point in time, there's several of them. In one point of time, in the New York Times bestseller list, the top 4 spots were 4 books from this series, despite the fact that the New York Times bestseller list does not count Christian bookstores. Right? They don't. That's not their market, and it still had the top 4 spots. There was a sensation about 8 or 10 years ago from another book called The Shack. I think it was on Oprah and stuff like that. But it's not just the Christian book market. There's guys like James Dobson. Do some of you know who James Dobson is? James Dobson was a child psychologist who wrote a book about parenting like a Christian. It was wildly successful. And then he started up a radio program. And he founded an organization, an NGO, a nonprofit, right? This is using our structures of capitalism and how we organize, called Focus on the Family. Focus on the Family was so big that during George W. Bush's reign, Karl Rove, if you remember Bush's brain, they called him, would call Dobson to see if Dobson approved of his Supreme Court nominees, because he didn't want Dobson going on the radio and saying he didn't approve him. That's how influential this guy was, right? Many scholars have noted that the evangelicals have constantly been on the cutting edge of adapting new technology. Around 1800 or the 1820s in the United States, the Methodists had the most sophisticated and largest printing presses in the world. And their magazine had a bigger circulation than any journal in the world. They had invested in technology to get their message out. When radio comes out, it is Christian preachers who will be at the forefront of using this. And guys will get famous like this. Billy Graham, who uses TV and radio. Some of you remember Jerry Falwell. And more recently, the YouTube generation, it's been this guy, Rob Bell. Rob Bell produces these little 10-minute videos, and they are slick and well-produced, and the younger set just loves him. He's really good. Okay? And so that is evangelicalism. Right? Now we have commoners as leaders. We have storytelling that pull on your emotions. It emphasizes free will because it values the individual and your right to choose. It emphasizes a God that is your friend, an approachable friend who loves you. Jesus, soft, warm emotions, not stern and harsh. You have an emotional role to play in the service. It's popular music, and it's innovative and adaptive. Okay. Let me pause there because I dumped a whole bunch on you. Are there any questions? I'll wait for the mic.
No, I missed the first few minutes, but I think I caught this drift. It's quite an interesting analysis, the weaving of context of contemporary ideas of the time, the nature of American society, and I'm wondering how cognizant were the people doing that, because there would have already been established Christian identity. I'm wondering what the resistance was to the traditional, and I imagine traditional could sometimes be flexible to adapt, but that's quite an analysis you put forward there. I'm just wondering the direct analysis and awareness of what's going on, and you see this emptying out into today. There's parallels to that today.
Yes. Some of this stuff would receive backlash from more traditionalists within these churches. For example, the going away from the educated ministers. Some of the educated ministers of the day said, you can't just listen to these people. They have no training. They don't know what they're doing. But the American spirit was very forward-looking, very, throwing off the old and looking to the new, and most of the population sort of went that way. Can I add something else? It's a wonderful book by this guy. I've shown you half the story, which is how the American spirit shaped evangelicalism. There's this one guy who reverses it and says, do not ignore how much evangelicalism implanted the democratic spirit into the American people in the early 1800s. He will tell you at the time that the government was tiny. Most people had little, there wasn't government like it is today, regulating life and stuff. He said most people had very little interaction with the government other than the post office. But what they had were these Methodist preachers and other preachers come and telling them about their individual worth, their freedom to choose. They would give them leadership roles and empower them. They taught a populist spirit. You don't have to listen to elites. Go with your own emotions. And he has a lot of stats and analysis that actually says America helps birth evangelicalism, but evangelicalism takes the ideas of the American Revolution and helps embed it in the population.
So I was just wondering if, because I know that you showed a bunch of different evangelical leaders, I was wondering, have women ever been significant leaders in evangelical churches?
Yeah. Excellent question. There always have been some, but never by any means half. So even today, like Donald Trump has a female evangelical that's kind of connected to him named Paula White. And I get Christianity Today, and it often covers some major evangelical leaders, but they're, 5 out of 6 are men or something like that. So there are some, but leadership has mostly been male historically. That answers your question. Oh yeah, Joyce Myers.
So yeah, you mentioned the Left Behind book series. I was just wondering, why is there this emphasis on sort of like end times and the apocalypse? I mean, what's the significance of that?
Yeah. Why is there an emphasis on the end times and the apocalypse? That is a good question. The bomb. The bomb. It will, what will happen, actually, I have a slide coming up that touches on this a bit. In the late 1800s and then the early 1900s, there's a bit of a split in the Protestant movement. This is the age of Darwin, and it's also the age of biblical criticism coming from Europe. And there'll be a split in the movement because some Christians will adapt to these ideas, and they become the liberal Protestants, frankly. But some Christians will see that everything's going to pot, that the promises of modernity are eroding people's trust in the Bible and teaching this Darwin stuff that's completely crazy. And instead of being progressive oriented, they will start to say, this is a sign that the end times are coming. And there was this unusual guy in the early 1800s who invented this whole schema of how the end times was going to unfold. He went through the Bible and sort of deciphers the clues and stuff like this. And this idea really took off, and it became popular in fundamentalist circles, and the Left Behind books are based on this guy's sort of schema. So it is the evangelicals started to become distrustful, actually, of the progress narrative, because you know what it is? The progress narrative puts too much faith in humanity, that we have all these brains and science, and our elites in the university are going to solve every problem. But where are they leading us? They're leading us to Darwin. They're leading us to criticize the Bible. It's a sign of the end. So it's a bit of a rejection of the elites and the progress narrative.
I think Elizabeth had.
Yeah, I'm thinking of some other aspects of earlier America, the moving frontier, the establishment of small settlement after small settlement. They didn't have their own churches, probably, so they certainly didn't have their own established churches of any kind. So if they had a church at all, it was either itinerant preachers coming in every so often, or the local guy who was pretty good at preaching, or a combination of the two. The other thing they didn't have was entertainment. I think it was Stuart McLean years ago talking about the CNE and how important it was when he was a boy, because it was colorful and exciting, and there was all this, a big production number in effect. And now he said we have TV.
Yeah, that's excellent, and that goes to that point I was saying earlier about how small government was in that book. That's right. They did it, but they had preachers and they had a church, and that was the communal organization. That was great.
We have just a couple more, and then we're gonna let Ryan go on.
Okay. Yeah.
2 points. In terms of the established churches and evangelicalism, the Unitarians were the sort of epitome of that established church, intellectual, ecumenical models at Harvard, et cetera, et cetera. But in the late 1800s, they also joined with the Universalist church, which is evangelical. So they actually have the two sides to which is perhaps an unusual model. I'm not sure, because you've got the historical context. The second point is that in terms of the actual the technological prowess of the evangelicals, if you look to, for example, Noam Chomsky, he will describe the manufacturing of consent within the right wing in the U.S. politics. He says, that the left missed completely their opportunity when the right actually bought up, I think it was in the 60s and 70s, most of the newspapers and radio stations and TV stations in the States, and therefore were able to construct narratives, populist narratives, that then took the politics, shifted it from center to right, and so the left, in fact, kind of got hijacked through that. The other example of that, I think, was when Bill Clinton was going through the Monica Lewinsky affair. He called upon a Protestant minister who was evangelical to do his counseling. So, there is an influence, recent influence for sure in recent history of their technological prowess and how it really has shaped and influenced.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. And the Republican criticism some people levy is that the Republicans were able sometimes to marry big business with this populist narrative by criticizing government. Even though the government programs are sometimes helping the poor, it would be portrayed as liberal elites. And so it married big business with the populist of the evangelical movement. And that sort of fits Chomsky's narrative as you were describing. Was there another question?
I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but we're talking about Donald Trump. There's a danger with Trump that he's leading a sort of religious movement, and that, like the House, I don't know much about politics, but I know that there was 2 or 3 days without him, something that we were trying to pass. But there is talk that he's, being evangelical, that he is using that power to this is going to sound weird, but with Russia, and never mind the things with prostitutes, that's not so important. What he's really after is sort of uniting Russia and America, and I think there was another state, I forget what it was. I was listening to it on CBC actually. I just thought that might be a thought. But another thought I had was when you were talking about going back, and I was wondering why you didn't mention Martin Luther.
Oh, yes. So I didn't discuss Martin Luther just because, of time, and because I actually thought, sometimes when I give this talk, I actually go back to the founding of Protestantism, because Protestantism is also connected to the birth of secularism and things like that. But I knew you wanted to go home at some point tonight. So to answer your question, he's very relevant. He's very relevant to the story, but in trying to figure out what to tell you and not tell you, I left him aside. Who's Martin Luther? He's not important. Okay. All right. What I want to do from here is from this, I debated a lot about how to do the rest of this presentation, because there's 2 directions I wanted to go, and it makes it a little disjointed. So I thought about dropping one, but in the end I didn't. So we're going to go in one direction, and then I'm going to come back to this slide, and we're going to go another direction. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. Again, I control the PowerPoint, so you have no choice. Yeah, that's right. I don't believe in the power of the commoners. No. Okay. So evangelicalism today remains quite populous. And actually, I started to talk about this in answering one of your questions. I talked about how Darwin and Darwinism and biblical criticism split American Protestantism. In what are now called the mainline denominations, they had a lot of educated ministers by this point in time. They tended to accept the teachings of Darwin and some of the criticisms of the Bible. And what they did is they shifted Christianity to what is called the social gospel. And the social gospel means that Christianity, that just means Christianity, is about helping the marginalized. It's not so much about converting people. It's about helping the poor. And what they will do is that they will make a big influence in America, because it is the social gospel folks, a century or so ago, who will start getting into government and saying we need to have institutions for the poor. We need to fix working conditions. We need fire codes in these fire trap buildings. They want to go and reform society and do stuff like that. And they really did change the country. Evangelicals, however, will become the split that does not go with this group. This is the progress narrative. They'll say, no. All this Darwin stuff is garbage. This biblical criticism is garbage. The virgin birth is real. And we have to hold on to the fundamentals. And some of them will hold on so tight to a set of writings called the fundamentals that they become known as the fundamentalists. This is where you get that word. It came from them. And they will not go to help the marginalized, but they will convert the marginalized. They will be the marginalized churches, and they will empower the marginalized. How? Because it will be the people who are not very rich will become the pastors of their churches, right? So they're not coming and giving you a soup kitchen, but they give you a role as a pastor, on a Sunday. And they invite you up front to tell your testimony of how God is working in your life. You see, they give them leadership positions and roles and influence. And you go to these churches and miracles happen that empower your life and make you feel touched by the sacred, even though maybe your job is a humdrum job, Monday to Friday. Okay? So they will be the populist movement. And you can still see this today. Evangelicalism today is not so socioeconomically marginalized. It's climbed the ladder. But the rhetoric today remains anti-state, anti-elites. It's populist rhetoric, right? Now, the next four or five slides, I want to talk about evangelical politics. And in doing this, just to lay it out there, some of this stuff is touchy stuff. This comes more from my dissertation because they're sensitive issues when we talk about politics. I'm not advocating for their positions or against them, but I do want to help explain them. And moreover, I'm hoping that when I'm done, that you will see how liberalism is not completely divorced from what they're doing. That there is some even though liberals will often disagree with these positions, if you stand far enough back, you'll be able to see the liberal DNA that's in there. Okay, does that make some sense? I hope. Okay, so what you will find is that they often use the language of liberalism. When they're talking about abortion, they don't just say how immoral that is. What they argue for are rights, the rights of the unborn. This is John Locke stuff, right? The rights of the individual. They don't just say that what you're doing violates God's will. They say you're infringing on my freedom, the freedom of religion. You see, it's in liberal language. This is a woman I study. This is Andrea Mrozik. She headed up an evangelical lobby group in Canada till a few years ago. They've now been subsumed in another group. And she also writes a blog called Pro-Woman, Pro-Life. Mrozik's a smart cookie. She has her master's degree from U of T, and she's been a journalist around the world and stuff like that. And I want to show you her arguments, just so you can understand them. And again, notice the nature of the arguments. So she would like a Canada without abortion by choice. She's not looking to change the laws, but she wants to convince people away from it. And one of her arguments is that abortion, although it's framed, she will claim, as about a woman's freedom, she will say, in truth, so much of abortion is not a woman with lots of choices making some free autonomous choice. She will claim that often women are doing it in situations where they feel trapped and pressured. And a partner is, a boyfriend is saying, please get the abortion. And the parents are saying, please get the abortion. And she feels pressured. And she will claim that often they are making this decision not being well informed about the consequences. And she'll pull out studies saying that it links to health concerns later and to poor mental health consequences and stuff like that. And so her argument is, who's going to bear the burden? Not the boyfriend, not the parents, the woman, right? And so she argues this often does not promote the woman's freedom. And of course, she'll argue about the freedom of the child, right? The child's right to life. So that's one touchy subject. She will also talk about divorce. And she will say that while divorce is, of course, necessary in cases like spousal abuse and stuff like that, she believes that we have over-liberalized divorce and that liberal divorce, by overdoing it, has harmed women. Why? She says that divorced women, and there's stats about this, endure higher rates of poverty and lower mental health and dealing with a child sometimes alone. She'll also, and I'm saying what she does, but actually she's just an example of what many lobbies in the evangelical world do. She'll argue against common law relationships. She'll again say that these harm women. Why? Because they'll point to studies, and there are issues here of correlation and causation, but she'll say that studies show that they have higher rates of poverty and are more likely to experience abuse, domestic abuse of some type, and their children are more likely to experience abuse. She doesn't argue, by the way, that divorce should be banned or that this should be against the law. But what she says is in schools, we should educate children about lifestyle choices in high school and about the statistics of what these lifestyle choices create. And the government should not treat common law as marriage, because if people marry, the outcomes will be better. So you shouldn't give them the tax breaks that you give to married couples and stuff like that. Right? And to give one last example, she does not like universal daycare. She's probably written about this more than anything. Why? She says that the idea of universal daycare is the government's going to tax you and create a daycare system that's free. But by taxing you, she argues, it increases your financial burden, which pushes you to have to go to work, she would argue. And she claims, and this is funny because she is a working woman. Now, she's not married, but she obviously is not opposed to women working. But she has written articles saying this view that is pushed, she would say, pushed on women, that you can have it all, that you can have a great career and lead at work, that you can come home and be a fantastic mom and be on the school board and do this and this and that. She would say is causing a lot of women immense stress, and she points to studies about women's health and happiness and mental health and says maybe this is a liberal lie. Maybe in truth we're being sold a bill of goods. And so what does she want? She liked Harper's idea, don't tax people and create universal daycare, give them checks of money. And if they want to use it for daycare, they can. If they want to put the kids with the grandparents, though, and work part-time, they can do that or whatever, right? And so what you get with Mrozek, and I realize that is all sensitive stuff, but what you get with Mrozek, her argument is what promotes women's freedom? Is it the right to abortion? Is it universal daycare so you can go to work? Is it liberalized divorce so you can escape a terrible marriage and stuff like that? Or is what promotes women's health being in stable marriages that are encouraged by government? Is it having the money to be able to stay at home if you want? Does this lead to better outcomes? And her argument is that liberalism today has gone over the edge. The idea of liberty has actually turned into license. You don't have to stay in your marriage, you can leave and stuff like that. And that this ultimately leaves us harmed and damaged by our decisions. And Christianity, she would argue, provides a more stable idea. It embeds people in relationships, in families, and this is the nurturing environment for adults to be happier, but also for their children. Okay. So that is the argument. My only point of showing you all that was, A, to understand a bit of her perspective, and I hope what you can see here is how much there is some liberal ideas in here about rights, about what brings true liberty and things like that. Liberals and evangelicals are not like Catholics arguing with Buddhists. It's like Catholics arguing with Protestants. They're arguing from a same family, sometimes over the same stories or values. In the United States, who owns the founding fathers? The evangelicals or the liberals, right? They're always arguing, is Thomas Jefferson a Christian or was he a deist and stuff? They're arguing over the same stock of characters and stories. Okay, does that make some sense? Okay. That was the end of one of these tree branches I wanted to go up on. Is there one or two questions? I don't want to do 7 or 8, but sure. And again, thanks for listening to that. I know that that's a sensitive kind of set of topics.
I was wondering, I had 2 questions. One question was, you were speaking about how she supports a lot of these viewpoints that also coincide with evangelicalism, with different studies. Do you think that can, to an extent, come from a place of this is originally like a strong belief and then just like searching for facts that justify that?
Oh, yeah, that's certainly a possibility, right? Is that one has a religious motivation for holding the position, and then you go out in the world and look for proof. And her partner, who is a guy, once actually basically said this in a way in an interview. There's actually a theological doctrine for this. It's a term that some of you might have heard of. It's called natural law. And natural law says that God made the universe and made the moral laws. And if you follow God's laws, as a result, it will also lead to human flourishing. So she expects that social science is going to back up that following God's laws lead to healthy outcomes. Yeah, so that's, yeah.
Okay, and another question I had is how and when did evangelicalism like sort of latch on to an abortion as an issue? Because my familiarity with the Catholic Church and that happening, at least like in a North American context, is that it became kind of commonplace, and then that's when like there was pushback.
Yeah. Oh, that's an excellent question. So here's the dirty secret about evangelicals and abortion. If you follow American politics, you always hear about Roe v. Wade, right? And evangelicals will point to it, and what a disaster. When Roe v. Wade came out, evangelicals were of mixed views on it. Have you ever heard of the Southern Baptist Convention? It's one of the largest evangelical denominations in the States. When Roe v. Wade came out, they came out with a press release saying, good. We're really happy. You can still go, at least several, the first time I read this, I almost fell out of my chair. I was like, that can't, I really trusted the author, but I'm like, that cannot be right. But I could actually go on Google and find their apology statements about, they're still apologizing about this 30 years later. What happened, yes, and Christianity Today, which is the main evangelical magazine, had an article that was like, we're not sure this is really good. We kind of think it's bad. But not like today, right, where it's like complete horribleness. What happened is, so Roe v. Wade's in 72. By about 76, you can start to feel the shift happening. As I understand, part of it came from the Catholics talking to evangelical leaders, because the Catholic Church was completely against abortion going back to 68. Part of it was it got associated not with protecting the mother, but with the sexual liberalism of the 60s. So it's not about saving mothers, it's about enabling unmarried women to have sex, okay? And then there was a big meeting of when the religious right was formed. They did not form over abortion, they formed over other issues. But by the second or third or fourth meeting, as they were grasping around for issues, someone said, how about abortion? And I know this is true because you can read people who were in the meeting telling you that this happened. And they grabbed onto abortion, and by 1976, the Southern Baptists are starting to get a little harsher on it. And around 77 or 78, some of you remember Jerry Falwell? Oh, yeah. Jerry Falwell came out and said abortion's horrible. And by 1980, it was on the Republican ticket. So it happened in about a 7 or 8 years period over the 70s. And so in 1975, all the Right to Life movement is all Catholic. But by 1985, there's a substantial evangelical contingent.
And the question that I have to that is, why in the first place would the Southern Baptist Convention support it? Is it because I know that it was privacy between the doctors was the grounds that abortion was challenged in the States, at least? So does that have something to do with it, the liberalism kind of?
A little bit. The other thing is, so there were two things. One, the Catholics were for abortion, and so it must be wrong. I mean, we're against abortion, so the Catholics are always wrong. And they really did see it. The other thing was the Baptists were about the Bible. What's the Bible say? And they felt like this is another place where the Catholics just don't care what's in the Bible. They invent their own stuff. The only Bible passage on this, some of you know the line where it says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? Yeah. So that passage is there. It's in the Bible. But right after that passage around it, what it says is something like, well, what happens if a man injures a woman and the child in her womb dies? And it says, well, if the child in her womb dies, the perpetrator has to pay the father. That's how it always works, right? You have to pay the father some shekels of silver. But otherwise, it's life for life, eye for eye, nose for nose, or whatever, right? And that passage seems to indicate that the life in the womb, if you follow me, is not the same as another life. Otherwise, it's life for life. But if you injure, then it's just some money, right? And so the Southern Baptists thought the Bible doesn't support this. It's another Catholic invention. But then they switched. And maybe, well, I don't know. The person in the corner had her hand up very early, I think.
Yeah, just speaking to that, I wonder if I recall my Bible reading, which is very sparse, correctly, it was something about the baby quickening. Yeah. But that's not what I want to speak to. Yeah. What I want to speak to is that there's a curious parallel movement to this position on the part of secular science represented by ethology, some quarters of ethology, which too is politicized, by the way. By ethology, I mean the study of humans as animals, and particularly human psychology as pertinent to the species, looking at us zoologically. And so there are big names in this. I'm thinking of two figures, very curiously named, last name Professors Tiger and Fox. Anyway, they got into a lot of trouble with what was the early version of what is now called the politically correct position, identity politics, early left-wing feminism, in that they argued more for the nature position than identity politics and political correctness would allow, which sometimes in its extremes veers towards the tabula rasa idea that we're blank slates, there is no nature, it's all nurture, it's all, the discourse, it's all created by social and economic discourses and institutions. What results in human behavior and thought. And that's very akin to the traditional Marxist position, with its idea of the superstructure and all that. Anyway, there is you probably are familiar with Christopher Lasch, The Culture of Narcissism.
Oh, yeah.
Now, he is old school left. In fact, I'd call him a Marxist. However, he wrote a couple of books that very much argued that the breakdown of the family is leading to all kinds of dire results for America, particularly this phenomenon of what is now almost clinical narcissism, widespread, what looks like, a pathology, on the part of very many young people. And he relates this to the breakdown of the traditional roles of the male and the female in the family, and particularly family stability. I took a course here in Toronto with a guy that's emeritus out of York University, and he's also the head of the Toronto Psychoanalytic Society. And he did a seminar on the work of a guy by the name of Elie Sagan, who was also out of Rochester, like Lasch was, and was a good friend, a colleague of Lasch's. And they talked the same way. Anyway, so he argues very much that way too, that the early, and I mean, this is being demonstrated by studies of where pathologies in children due to separation from or trauma, with the mother in the earliest years. So there is science behind this. Anyway, so he argues that, what we think of as morality in Freudian terms, that is the superego, that's a later accretion to a much earlier structure or stage that he would properly be called the conscience, in which we learn how to be loving and compassionate when we're infants.
Yeah.
Due to the interaction with the mother. Anyway, so this kind of, and so a figure like Jordan Peterson that everybody's probably heard of here, he's very much of that school, and he apparently recently published a book on these themes, and of course he's getting, a firestorm from the identity politics people, but it's complicated.
Yeah,
so,
it is.
Yeah,
there is I'm seeing this in universities too, is there is kind of on the one hand, on the one camp, kind of what's called postmodernism that tends to sort of devalue sort of biology and see the human as very malleable by culture, more of a blank slate. And there is a bit of a pushback mechanism. And some of it does come out of animal studies, as you say. And the evangelicals really are in this pushback group. There are lots of the people there who are not evangelicals. But they really argue that, and they've written many articles on this, including by her, biology matters. That there is something to biology, and you can't just pretend it doesn't matter. So they're part of that.
Yeah, so that's the natural law.
That's a natural law.
By the Catholics long ago.
Yeah.
Let's say that there are biological.
Yeah, that's right.
Systems and principles that we.
That's right. But even people like, I don't know if any of you know Steven Pinker, who's famous, right? But he's also a guy who wrote a book basically saying the blank slate is an error, that actually your genes and stuff like that shape you. Okay. All right.
We're
so
try and press on. I'm
yeah.
sorry. There's several people having.
Sorry about that.
Out of time otherwise.
Yeah, that's right. So I said we were going to go down one trunk of the tree, and then I said I'm going to bring you back. We're going to go the other way. You remember that? So that's what we're going to do now. And also, I'll just take a second. I'm just going to pass this around. It's just a sign-up sheet. If any of you want to be in my email list, it just asks for your first name. I really don't need your last name and your email. And it'll just tell you if I'm giving talks in Toronto. You don't have to sign it, but... oh, wonderful. There you go.
Can you indicate whether you're evangelical or not?
I do not need to know any religious affiliation. Okay. All right. So back here, remember I was telling you about how innovative and adaptive it was, and there was Google, there was Rick Warren, and Billy Graham. As big as Billy Graham was, in the 20th century, no Christian is more famous other than perhaps John Paul II. As big as Billy Graham was, he was not the most important innovation to come out of evangelicalism in the 20th century. The most important innovation to come out of evangelicalism started in the most unlikely situation possible. It came from this man, William J. Seymour, uneducated guy who walks into a home church in Los Angeles. And there is long prayer meetings going on night after night after night. And Seymour, one day, starts to speak in tongues. Now, some of you will know that in the New Testament, there is an event where the apostles, the Holy Spirit appears as flames over their heads, and they speak in tongues. They speak one language, but all the people there from all over the world or the Middle East can understand them in their own tongues. It's a miracle. And some Christians believe that at the end time, the miracles of the New Testament will come to fruition again. And so here is Seymour, and what is Seymour doing? He is speaking in tongues. The very technical term for this is glossolalia. Now, unlike the apostles, other people could not understand him, regardless of what language they understood. But the folks who buy into this understand that he's speaking a heavenly language. And soon it's not just Seymour, then this woman does it, and then another person, and another person. And these revivals go on night after night, week after week. It outgrows the house. They move to a church on Azusa Street, which is why it's called the Azusa Street Revival. And they launch Pentecostalism, right? And it is a movement that will grow like wildfire. People are speaking in tongues. You can feel the Holy Spirit here. There are divine healings, miraculous healings. There are exorcisms. They're casting demons out of people and changing their lives. And it spreads quickly. They quickly create a free newspaper, and before very long, they're sending missionaries out. And within 3 or 4 years, it's in basically every major city in the United States. And it's also very populist. He immediately has mixed races at these meetings. Now, eventually, they will get segregated, but originally, there's blacks, there's whites, there's Latinos. Women are in roles of speaking and leadership early on. Again, some of that will ebb away later, but it's populist. And it will therefore spread not only in the United States, but some of these people will spread it back to, if they're immigrants, to other countries, to Latin America and beyond. And so Pentecostalism has spread like crazy to places like Africa, to South America. In Brazil and in Latin America, it is the greatest threat to the Catholic Church, really. And to Asia, places like Korea have enormous growth in Christianity, as does China. There are definitely more Chinese people going to a church on Sunday than there are in Canada. There's no question about it. And it's very powerful in the developing world. In some of these situations, in some of these cultures, the religion that is there grew up in a different soil. In some cases, for example, it might be a tribal religion. And that tribal religion requires tribal life. Or at least it's suited to tribal life. The whole tribe gets together, there's a tribal ritual, there are roles for everyone to engage in. But the problem is now is the soil is changing. It's like climate change, but culturally, right? Because what's happening? Well, capitalism is coming in and it's decimating tribal economies, right? And now you have to move to a city. There's urbanization. And there you don't live as a tribe. You live as an individual. There's just you and your spouse. You feel isolated in the city, right? And now this old religion, sometimes it's like a plant that was used to one soil, and now all of a sudden the acidity of the soil has changed or something. It doesn't work very well, right? But you know what's there? There's something that is adapted to this new environment. There is Pentecostalism, which first came from missionaries, but now is completely led by local folks because it's well embedded. And Pentecostalism knows how to deal with capitalism. They run big churches and they collect money and they build enormous churches and they buy radio stations and they create films to spread the message. It's used to urbanization. It knows how to thrive in the city and how to create a community in a very individualistic new age. It's ready. It's ready for it, right? As the Western environment spreads, this religion born in the West is ready to spread too. And there's one other thing Pentecostalism does. Someone mentioned Martin Luther earlier. Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation and secularism, they criticized a lot of things that were in medieval Catholicism. Medieval Catholicism, you could go and touch relics from the Virgin Mary. You could see breast milk from the Virgin. You could see splinters from the cross and from Noah's Ark. And you could be healed. There was miraculous things that you could go and touch and see. And there were miraculous times. There were feast days for this saint or that saint or that saint. Martin Luther and the others will say, this is complete garbage. They'll say, there's so many splinters of the cross you could build Noah's Ark. All of this is garbage. This is idolatry. And all this feast days praying to saints is idolatry. We should only worship God. And when they do this, what they do inadvertently, this is a law of unintended consequences, is they strip the physical world of the sacred. It becomes homogeneous. It's secular almost, right? It's just objects and ordinary time. Whether you're secular or Protestant on this view doesn't really matter. You see the world as what's called, a famous sociologist called it, the disenchantment of the world. And what does Pentecostalism do? Many scholars have written it re-enchants the world. Now there are divine healings going on Sunday in that building. There's someone speaking in tongues. He might be a janitor, right? But now he is empowered. He is speaking in the sacred language. There are exorcisms. I saw Satan cast out of this person, right? Miracles are happening. In the New Testament, it says that the followers of Christ will be able to pick up snakes, and the snakes themselves won't even bite them. And so in the Appalachians, they have snake handlers, these guys who go and pick up these poisonous snakes. And of course, every once in a while, one of them gets bit. But it's proof. In Pentecostalism, you can touch, feel, and hear the miraculous, even though it's 2018. Right? It's not all just ordinary and boring. You can touch it. And the other thing about the Pentecostals is they often preach what's called the prosperity gospel. And the prosperity gospel is if you just turn to Jesus, he will bring about prosperity for you. He will bring you wealth. Donate to the church, it will come back to you 10 times. And a lot of this is very morally dicey, and it gets critiqued even within evangelical circles. But there's a lot of preachers teaching this prosperity gospel, and it's very popular in the third world, in the developing world, sorry. Some of these churches include the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God in Brazil. It was founded in the 1970s. It has 12 million members now. What else do you know that was founded in the 1970s that has 12 million members? Right? What's that? The Mormon Church, yeah, that's right, which started earlier, but actually this has grown faster than the Mormons. Millions more abroad. They have a church here in Toronto, by the way. The largest church in the world is in South Korea, the Yodo Full Gospel Church. 750,000 people, one congregation with multiple sort of locations, right? So this is what's going on. Okay, so to wrap up, Evangelicalism and Pentecostalism, I've tried to suggest to you, are modern religions. And by modern, I mean that they empower the individual. Their roots are in liberalism. You can see the liberal DNA there. They argue that truth is found in your personal emotions, not in the doctrine, not in the sacrament, not in what the priest tells you, but in you, in your heart, right? In the personal experience that you had of Jesus. And you're valued as an individual so that you have a personal relationship with Christ. And it's entrepreneurial and innovative. It's ready for capitalism. It's ready for a secular state. It doesn't need state support. It's going to go and build its own institutions. As a result, Pentecostalism is probably the most successful religion in the world today. There were 0 Pentecostals 100 years ago. Today, some estimates, kind of the most accurate, I think, are that it's around 300 million people, which is about as many Buddhists as there are in the world, from nothing in a century. Okay, and that is Evangelicalism and Pentecostalism.
I'm just curious why it is that evangelism took such a strong hold in the U.S. and not so much in Canada. I mean, at least that's my impression. And I'm also curious if you have any theories on as to why the American strain of evangelism took such a political turn, whereas in Canada, it seems not so much.
Yeah, those are two big questions. Okay, so the first one, why did it not do as well in Canada? Although the original Great Awakening, I told you, was in Great Britain and Canada and the States, and was as powerful here as in the States, what happened in Britain is the established churches kind of got back in charge of it eventually. And they calmed down those tent meetings, and they started educating their ministers. And it was very British, the stereotype of British formality, right? And the Britain was a little bit afraid of the populism of America with its revolution and all that sort of stuff. And the same thing happened in Canada, which was very British. From about the late 1700s to the early 1800s, it calms down in Canada and becomes more dominated by a few churches. In 1850 Canada, 4 or 5 Protestant churches had something like 95% of the Protestants in the land. And if you added the Catholics, it was 97% of the people in the land. Whereas in the States, they've got, by this point, like denominations all over the place. They've got the Oneidas and the Millerites and the Mormons, and Christian Science is going to pop up and stuff like that. So in the British colonies, the idea of the crown and the state and the elites will regain control, but they don't in the States. They never regain it. It goes crazy. Not crazy, it just splinters in a million ways. So it remains populist, and so that was why. You had another question, and I've completely forgot it.
Oh, just how the U.S. evangelism became so political.
Yeah, so why did it become so political in the States? It happens post-World War II. In the States, they start to associate patriotism with being Christian, because the Nazis were attacking Christianity, and they came out of Germany, which is where biblical criticism comes out of. They actually start associating atheism with Nazism and then with communism, and all of that believes in Darwin. And so freedom is being Christian and American patriotic. And that sort of weird thing happens in the 1950s in the States and has maintained to the current day. Whereas in Canada, studies have shown that Canadian evangelicals hold similar views on social, moral, family values issues as their American cousins, but they don't politicize it to a party, and they don't talk about it at church with the frequency of American evangelicals. So they hold similar views, but it's not as politicized, and they're less likely to see the kind of the elites attacking the country, the liberal elites attacking the country and stuff like that.
Lots of religions and lots of parts of Christianity specifically have a big focus on creating a community and having church as part of your life outside of just Sundays.
Yeah.
Does the Evangelical Church try and do this, or is it just turn up to your sermon and go home?
Yeah, the evangelicals are gurus at this, at creating society and culture. So Bruxy Cavey, the Canadian guy I told you, with the T-shirt and the jeans, remember him, the pacifist? So his church, although he gives this great big sermon on Sunday, what he really wants you to do is sign up for home church. And home church is you meet in somebody's home in a pod of like 8 or 10 people on Tuesdays, and you get a list of questions that have to do with the sermon you listen to on the weekend. And not only that, but really what happens over time is those people become your closest intimates. You share the struggles you're having with your son and your job and your marriage. And when you lose your job, those people are there for you. They will be there. And so, and then there's activities for youth. They have fantastic and dynamic youth programs. They have charity runs and charity events that you can get in, and your whole family can go to often in the rest of our life, like you go, but there's not a place your family can go, but here your whole family can go, and they know the other whole families. So it's very communal, and it takes up more and more of your free time, but it's you find meaning in it, and it becomes your most intimate network. Yeah. Generally, people who are religious in North America and attend weekly any religious community show higher levels of happiness than people in North America who don't. And from what I can gather, there's some people who've tried to parse this using sophisticated means, and they think it's because they have better community, basically.
Thank you for a very nice lecture. I believe there are some studies that have been done worldwide to show the sort of inverse relationship to the importance of religion in life to the educational level. In other words, particularly in some of the Scandinavian countries, which have a high education level, there's a lower interest in religion.
Yeah.
Is there anything specific to evangelism and Pentecostalism which would indicate the lower the education level of a country, the higher their interest in these strains?
So with Pentecostalism, I think it has done better in cultures that have not had as high education. Evangelicalism, though, has done very well in the States and tends to do well both with, lots of them have university degrees. That wasn't true in 1950, but it is today. They've caught up to the rest of society on that front. There are some worldwide global studies that suggest that generally as education rises, religiosity decreases. So there is the relationship you talk about, but in the States, the evangelicals do well on education, and the Mormons do fantastic on education. So there are some groups that buck a larger trend, I guess.
Just similarly to that question, I'll ask the gender question. It's been considered that with the traditional religions, that there's a skewing, and this has long been the case, towards women attending church more often, being the points of conversion in a family. In fact, this goes back to earliest Christianity. And to a certain extent, this was seen as possibly linked to women's lower educational attainments, the greater interest in mysticism, the supernatural, the emotional. How did the figures play out? Let's say, has anybody done studies on, is there a gender imbalance as to who's interested in these two forms?
Sure. I don't know the exact stats. I can say a few things about that. The skewing of Christianity towards women actually happens in the very period I was talking to you about in the 1800s. If you remember, I said there was a revaluing of human emotions, and they went away from the harsh judging Godfather to the loving Jesus, who's kind of warm and stuff like that. It starts to value, forgive the stereotyping, but stereotypical feminine emotions of love and compassion and tenderness and gentleness. And it's at this point that Christianity starts to become more weighted towards female participation versus male. There was something else. As for today, I don't know the stats. What I do know is for Pentecostalism in the developing world, one of the great, it spreads, the women are the means that it spreads, but its power is that it often enables these women to bring their husbands to church. And the term for this in academic literature is the patriarchal bargain. And what it means is what's happening is these women, because the doctrine is that the man is the head of the family and she has to submit to him and stuff like that. But what they're finding a lot of these contexts is when these women do this, these men turn away from womenizing and gambling and drinking and become devoted fathers and husbands. So it's a patriarchal bargain. You pledge your sort of, that he is the leader, but often he's sort of stepping up to the plate, and it gives him this leadership role, and he eschews the license that was tearing at the family before. So it's well known, in a lot of, like, I know this is a thing in Latin America, and yeah, scholars call it the patriarchal bargain. Yeah, they would fit into it very well. And that also they would fit that label of kind of the patriarchal bargain. Over here. There was a hands over here. By the way, I know some folks have to leave. If you do leave, I just wanted to tell you again, consider coming to my Discovery Week. I'd love to have you. It is so much fun. It's just a week of, it's just really rich. So I'd love to have you. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to mention something that Valerie said. I think sometimes in Christianity, because you have to realize it comes from Judaism, that the Jewish women were not expected to go to the shul either. It was only men back then.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's a bit different in kind of the traditional or Orthodox Judaism.
I rather think there's a relationship between the shift that you noted between the judgmental God the Father to the friendly Jesus, and the advent of lots of women ministers. 'Cause I'm old enough to remember when people used to expect their minister or their priest or whoever to tell them what to do. He was the authority. They didn't necessarily do it, but they wanted someone authoritative, and at least in those days, that was not the role of a woman. Women were compassionate and kind and gentle and so on. And nowadays, I think people want something different from their minister, and what they want is something that a woman can give. Also, 100 years ago, there were no, maybe a little more than 100 years ago, there were no Sunday papers in this town. And the Monday newspapers would have articles covering the sermons in the principal churches. I mean, this was when you could shoot up a cannon up Yonge Street on a Sunday morning and not hit anybody. And I can remember in the Eisenhower approach to religion was it didn't matter what your religion was, but you had to have one. It was socially unacceptable not to have some religion or other. If you didn't go to church, at least most Sundays, what would the neighbors say? That has changed. I don't know. Obviously, these churches are doing very well. I wonder what percentage of the population nowadays goes to a worship service of any kind on a weekly basis.
Yeah, and yeah, you're right, it has changed. I think in Canada the stats are that somewhere close to 1 in 5 go somewhere weekly. Sometimes those numbers might be slightly inflated. And in the States, people claim a number more like 2 in 5. I say claim because there is a particularly feeling in the States that there's a bias to say that you go more than you do because it's a socially valid thing to say. But roughly twice what it is here.
Maybe Canadians don't lie as much.
We'll take one last one, and then we can continue the discussion over snacks.
Okay.
How do the recent sects like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, how do they fit into this?
Yeah, excellent. The way that Mormons and Jehovah's Witness and Christian Science and all those fit in is that the United States, someone used the word the frontier. The United States is the frontier. It's open season. And as I told you, there's 1 million people starting things in their basements. Mormonism is another Instagram, right? It just takes off. It's founded in the 1830s in the United States. A lot of those other traditions start out kind of a generation, well, more like in the late 1800s. But it's because the United States is open season. Anyone can start anything. And in the 1800s, the United States has to be considered one of the most fruitful for starting up Christian denominations since the Reformation, basically. But that doesn't happen in Canada, because in Canada, just that question you asked earlier, a few denominations will grab hold and reassert control here. And so people don't start starting things up all over the place. But in the United States, it remains the Wild West. And you can start stuff all over the place, and every once in a while something takes off.
Let's thank Brian again.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
And we can continue the discussion over snacks, so invite people to stay if you're able, and we'll keep talking.